Transgender woman rejected at airport, then returns owning the airline. How will this story turn out? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. Samantha Blake adjusted the strap of her purse as she stepped through the sliding glass doors of the airport. Her heels clicked confidently against the polished floors, her pink dress flowing elegantly behind her. This trip was everything. A new job, a new opportunity, a life-changing moment she had worked so hard for. She approached the check-in counter with a polite smile, placing her passport and ticket on the counter. The airline agent, a young man with neatly combed hair, took the documents and began typing into his computer. At first, everything seemed routine. Then, his expression changed. His eyes flickered from the screen to Samantha, then back again. His fingers hesitated on the keyboard. Samantha frowned. "Is there a problem?" The agent forced a smile, but there was something nervous behind his eyes. "I just need to check something. One moment, please." He turned and whispered to another employee, who glanced at Samantha before hurriedly disappearing into a back office. Samantha's stomach tightened. She had been through situations like this before. The questioning looks, the second-guessing, the unnecessary scrutiny. She inhaled deeply, reminding herself that she was here as a professional, as a woman on a mission. Minutes stretched into eternity. Other passengers checked in and moved along. The agent refused to make eye contact with her. Finally, a supervisor emerged, a middle-aged woman with a stern expression and an air of forced politeness. She took Samantha's passport and examined it carefully, flipping through the pages as though expecting to find something wrong. "Ms. Blake," the woman said, her voice tight, "there seems to be an issue with your travel documents." Samantha stiffened. "What kind of issue?" The supervisor pursed her lips. "Your gender marker on your passport does not match the gender on your booking." Samantha felt her stomach drop. "That's a mistake. I updated all my legal documents over a year ago." The woman gave a thin-lipped smile, the kind that wasn't a smile at all. "Regardless, we cannot allow you to board the flight until this discrepancy is resolved." Samantha's pulse quickened. "Resolved how? Everything is correct?" The supervisor's tone remained neutral, but her gaze carried something colder. "I'm afraid you will not be flying with us today." A hush fell over the check-in area. Other passengers glanced at her, some whispering, others avoiding her gaze altogether. Samantha's hands clenched at her sides. "You're telling me I can't board my flight because you don't like what my documents say?" The supervisor's smile didn't waver. "I'm telling you that we follow protocol, and according to our system, there is an inconsistency. You are welcome to resolve this with the proper authorities." Samantha felt the humiliation creep up her spine. They wanted her to leave. They wanted her to walk away quietly, to disappear. She straightened her shoulders. "I want to speak to someone higher up." The woman didn't even flinch. "I am the highest authority available right now." Samantha's lips pressed together. She could feel the stares, the judgment, the whispers of people who thought they understood but never would. A security guard appeared at her side. "Ma'am, I need you to step aside." Samantha took a deep breath. She could make a scene. She could scream, cry, demand justice. But she knew how that would end. A story about a disruptive passenger who had to be removed. She wouldn't give them that. Instead, she grabbed her passport off the counter, turned on her heel, and walked away with her head held high. But as she passed the row of airline employees, she caught a hushed conversation between them. "That's the one they flagged earlier. I don't get why they even let people like that buy tickets. They don't belong here." Samantha's hands tightened around the handle of her suitcase. They thought they had one. They thought they had erased her. They had no idea who they were dealing with. She pulled out her phone, her fingers shaking only slightly as she dialed a number. A deep voice answered almost immediately. "Samantha?" She exhaled, her voice calm despite the fire burning inside her. "I need you to do something for me." The pause. "Then, what do you need?" Samantha stepped through the automatic doors, out into the fresh air. The same airport that had just rejected her stood behind her, unaware of what was coming. "I need to buy an airline." Samantha sat in the back of a sleek black car, her fingers drumming against the leather armrest. The city skyline blurred past her as she stared out the window, her mind racing. What had happened at the airport wasn't new. It wasn't even surprising. But this time, she wouldn't let it go. Her phone buzzed. She glanced down at the screen. Mark Ellison, incoming call. She answered immediately. "Tell me you have good news." Mark's voice was smooth, businesslike. "Depends on what you consider good. I've spoken to a few investors, and they're interested. They don't love the PR nightmare that Airline is about to walk into." Samantha smirked. "That's what I was hoping for." Mark continued. "The company has already started damage control. They're calling it a misunderstanding. Some weak apology about how they respect all customers." Samantha's jaw tightened. "They're lying." "Of course they are," Mark said. "But they're bleeding. Stock's down 3% since this morning. Shareholders are nervous." Samantha leaned back in her seat. "How do we make them more nervous?" Mark chuckled. "I love when you get like this. I've got a few strategies. First, we amplify the story. We make sure no one forgets what they did. Second, we start buying shares. Quietly for now. If we get enough leverage, we can shake them from the inside." Samantha tapped her nails against her phone. "I don't want to shake them. I want to own them." Mark paused. "That's going to take a lot of money, Samantha." "I have a lot of money. You'll need allies. The board won't go down without a fight." Samantha's lips curled into a small smile. "Then we make sure they don't have a choice." She ended the call and turned her attention back to the passing buildings. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about power. For years, she had fought to be seen, to be respected. She had built her career on resilience, on never backing down. But no matter how successful she became, there were always people who wanted to push her aside, make her invisible. Not anymore. She opened her laptop and began typing. Within minutes, the first article went live. High-powered CEO denied boarding over gender identity, discrimination, or policy? The internet erupted. By morning, Samantha's story was everywhere. News outlets debated it. Social media exploded with hashtags demanding accountability. Celebrities and activists spoke out in support. And the airline? They were scrambling. Their PR team released another statement, this time with more carefully chosen words. They promised to review internal policies and ensure this never happens again. But the damage was done. Stock prices dipped lower. Analysts speculated about potential lawsuits. Investors whispered about instability. And that was exactly what Samantha wanted. She sat in her office, scrolling through the latest financial reports when Mark walked in, tossing a folder onto her desk. "You're going to love this," he said. Samantha flipped it open, scanning the numbers. Her eyebrows lifted. "This is their quarterly loss?" Mark nodded. They were struggling before this. And now, well, let's just say a little push might send them tumbling. Samantha closed the folder. "Then let's push." The next week was a whirlwind. Samantha and Mark met with private investors, hedge funds, and rival airlines. The plan was simple: buy up enough shares to gain leverage. It wouldn't be an outright takeover, yet, but it would be enough to make them nervous. The airline board held emergency meetings. They knew something was happening, but they didn't know who was behind it. Not yet. Samantha attended a high-profile industry event that weekend, a gathering of the most powerful players in aviation. She moved through the crowd effortlessly, exchanging pleasantries, making calculated connections. Then she saw him. Richard Callaway, the airline CEO. He was deep in conversation with a senator, laughing, completely unaware that his company was under attack. Samantha picked up a glass of champagne and walked toward him. As she approached, he turned, smiling automatically, until his eyes landed on her. His expression faltered. She extended a hand. "Mr. Callaway, I don't believe we've met." He hesitated before shaking her hand. "Richard Callaway. And you are?" She smiled. "Samantha Blake." His grip tightened slightly. He knew who she was now. "I've heard your name a lot lately," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "I imagine you have." He took a sip of his drink, studying her. "I'm sorry for what happened to you at our airport." She tilted her head. "Are you?" His smile didn't reach his eyes. Of course, we never intended for... Samantha leaned in slightly. I don't need an apology, Mr. Calloway. I need you to start packing your office. His jaw tensed. She stepped back, flashing a polite smile before walking away, leaving him standing there, speechless. She had made her first move. And she wasn't done yet. The boardroom was filled with tension. Richard Calloway sat at the head of the long mahogany table, fingers laced together as he listened to his executives throw around possible solutions. The airline was losing money fast. Investors were pulling back, and the media coverage wasn't dying down. This needs to stop, one board member snapped. The PR disaster alone is costing us millions. If we don't control the narrative, we're going to have a shareholder revolt. We need to reach out to her, another chimed in. Make her an offer, settle privately before this gets worse. Calloway exhaled sharply. She's not interested in an apology. The room fell silent. They all knew what Samantha Blake wanted. Power. And she was getting it. Reports had surfaced that an unnamed investor was rapidly buying up shares in the company. The board wasn't stupid. They knew it had to be her. But what they didn't know was how to stop it. Calloway turned to his financial advisor. How much does she control? The man hesitated. It's hard to say exactly, but if she's working with private investors, she could already hold over 15% of the company. 15%. That was dangerously close to a controlling stake. She's moving faster than we expected, Calloway muttered. A deep, unsettling silence settled over the room. They had underestimated her. And now they were paying the price. Samantha sat in her office, watching the stock prices fluctuate in real time. Every dip, every nervous sell-off, every bit of instability, it was all going according to plan. Mark entered, a smirk playing on his lips. You rattled them? Samantha sipped her coffee. Good. They're going to try to negotiate. She set her cup down. Let them. They'll offer you money. She smiled. I don't want their money. Mark chuckled. I knew you'd say that. He slid a folder across her desk. Legal team says we have enough leverage to demand a leadership position. Samantha leaned back. Not interested in a seat at their table. Mark raised an eyebrow. Then what do you want? Samantha folded her hands together, eyes glinting with something sharp. I want their table. Mark let out a low whistle. Hostile takeover it is. She glanced at her watch. Set up the next investor meeting. I want this done before they even know what's happening. Mark nodded. On it? Samantha exhaled slowly, staring out the window. This was happening, and there was no stopping her now. The following week, Samantha made her biggest move yet. She publicly announced her intent to acquire a controlling stake in the airline, making it clear that she wasn't just an angry customer, she was a businesswoman on a mission. The airline's stock plummeted further, panicked investors scrambling to sell before the company collapsed under the weight of scandal. Calloway tried to counter the damage. He went on TV, gave interviews, claimed the airline was committed to inclusivity and that one unfortunate incident doesn't define the company. But no one believed him, because Samantha's voice was louder. She did interviews, too, sharing her story, her vision, her determination to create a company that truly valued every customer. And the world listened. By the time the airline board held an emergency vote, it was too late. Samantha had secured the majority. Richard Calloway was forced to step down. And the company? It was now hers. She walked into the executive suite for the first time, heels clicking against the marble floors. The office that had once belonged to Calloway was now hers. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the city, the skyline stretching far beyond the horizon. Mark stepped in behind her. You did it. She smiled. I did. He handed her a folder. First order of business? She opened it, flipping through the pages. New policies, new leadership, a new future for the airline. She circled one name in particular. The airport manager who had humiliated her. She closed the folder. I want them gone. Mark smirked. Consider it done. Samantha took a deep breath. She wasn't just changing the airline. She was rewriting the rules. Samantha sat at the head of the boardroom table, a place where, just weeks ago, she had been nothing more than a name on a list. A customer dismissed, denied, humiliated. Now, every executive in the room sat stiffly, waiting for her to speak. She could feel their discomfort, their uncertainty. They weren't sure what kind of leader she would be. They had spent years under the old system, a culture of quiet discrimination, unchallenged privilege. That era ended today. She set down the thick file in front of her, folded her hands, and looked around the room. "Let's begin." A senior board member cleared his throat. "Ms. Blake, we understand you're eager to make changes, but we do have a brand reputation to consider. Too much disruption could." Samantha raised a hand, cutting him off. "Let's talk about reputation. This airline had a reputation long before I stepped in. A reputation for exclusion, discrimination, and a blatant disregard for passengers like me. That's why we're here. That's why I'm here. And that's why the first order of business is dismantling that reputation." The man swallowed but said nothing. Samantha turned to another executive. "I want a full review of company policies, from hiring practices to employee conduct. I want mandatory inclusivity training at every level: gate agents, customer service, corporate offices. If you work under this airline's name, you will know how to treat every customer with dignity." She didn't wait for them to nod in agreement. She moved to the next point. "I also want names. Every employee involved in the incident that denied me boarding, every supervisor who let it happen, every manager who ignored the complaints afterward. Their time here is over." A murmur rippled through the room. One executive finally spoke up. "Ms. Blake, we should be careful with mass firings. It could cause instability." Samantha leaned forward, her expression calm but unyielding. "This company has been unstable for years. You just didn't see it because the damage was happening to people like me. That ends now." Silence. Then Mark, sitting at her right, cleared his throat. "I'll make sure the terminations are handled smoothly." Samantha nodded. "Good." She closed the file. "One last thing. Customer service policies are changing immediately. I want every single frontline employee to know that if they ever disrespect a passenger the way I was disrespected, they'll be out the door before their next shift." The executives sat in stunned silence. Samantha stood. Meeting adjourned. As she walked out, she could feel their eyes on her, but she didn't care. She wasn't here to make them comfortable. She was here to make things right. The news broke the next morning. New airline CEO implements sweeping reforms, fires discriminatory staff within first week. The public loved it. Passengers who had been discriminated against in the past came forward with their stories, praising Samantha for taking action. Airline competitors scrambled to release their own statements about commitment to inclusivity, trying to keep up. And the employees who had humiliated her? They were gone. The gate agent who had refused to let her board? Fired. The supervisor who had smugly told her she couldn't fly? Fired. The security officer who had escorted her away, barely hiding his smirk? Fired. Samantha didn't lose sleep over it. She had lost too much already. A week later, she walked through the same airport where everything had started. But this time, she wasn't a rejected passenger. She was the CEO of the airline. The moment she entered, heads turned. Employees whispered, some nervous, some in awe. They knew who she was now. She approached the check-in counter, this time with confidence, not fear. A new agent stood there, shifting nervously before clearing her throat. "Ms. Blake, it's an honor to have you flying with us today." Samantha gave her a small smile. "Thank you." As she received her boarding pass, she felt someone watching her. Turning, she spotted a familiar face. The supervisor from that night, the woman who had denied her, humiliated her. The woman wasn't smiling anymore. She wasn't in uniform either. She was just another passenger, another person moving through the airport like everyone else. For a moment, their eyes met. Samantha saw recognition, regret, and maybe even fear in the woman's face. Samantha held her gaze for just a second longer before turning away. She didn't need revenge. She had already won. The flight attendants greeted her warmly as she boarded, her seat waiting for her in first class. She settled in, adjusting the silk cuff of her sleeve, feeling completely at home in a space where she had once been made to feel so unwelcome. As the plane taxied down the runway, She gazed out the window, watching the airport shrink in the distance. She had come back, not as a victim, not as an outcast. She had come back owning the very thing that tried to erase her. And as the plane lifted into the sky, Samantha let out a slow breath, a small, satisfied smile forming on her lips. She had reclaimed her power, and no one would ever take it from her again. The flight was smooth, the hum of the engine steady as Samantha gazed out at the clouds stretching endlessly beyond the horizon. She had spent years proving herself in boardrooms, on executive panels, in meetings filled with people who barely concealed their skepticism about her presence. But no moment had ever felt as fulfilling as this one. She wasn't just a passenger now. She was in control. A flight attendant approached with a warm smile. "Miss Blake, would you like anything to drink?" Samantha looked up and returned the smile. "A glass of champagne, please?" The attendant nodded and moved away. Samantha leaned back in her seat, exhaling slowly. This moment was surreal. Just weeks ago, she had been humiliated at this very airport, treated as if she didn't belong. And now? Now, she belonged more than anyone in this cabin. Her phone vibrated on the table beside her. She picked it up, glancing at the notification. Breaking news: former CEO Richard Callaway under investigation for discriminatory practices at National Airline. Samantha's lips curled into a small smile. She tapped the article open, scanning through the details. The investigation was uncovering years of misconduct, instances of discrimination buried under bureaucracy, complaints swept under the rug, policies designed to exclude rather than include. It was exactly what she had suspected. Callaway's downfall wasn't just about her. It was about everyone he had harmed, everyone he had denied, everyone he had dismissed. Mark had texted her the link, followed by a single message. "We did it." She typed back, "This is just the beginning." As the plane soared through the sky, Samantha felt something unfamiliar, a sense of true, unshakable peace. For so long, she had fought just to exist in spaces that weren't made for her. But now, she wasn't asking for permission. She was rewriting the rules. The flight attendant returned, placing the glass of champagne on the tray beside her. Samantha lifted it, gazing at the golden liquid, the bubbles rising to the surface. A toast to power, to justice, to change. She took a slow sip, letting the warmth settle in her chest. From here on out, things would never be the same. She had made sure of it. Samantha stepped off the plane, the air crisp as she walked through the jet bridge. The airport was bustling with travelers, announcements echoing overhead, but for her, everything seemed to move in slow motion. This wasn't just another arrival, it was a full-circle moment. As she entered the terminal, a group of reporters stood waiting. They had been following her story from the beginning, from the moment she was denied her flight to her stunning takeover of the airline. The moment they spotted her, microphones were raised, cameras flashing. "Ms. Blake, do you have any comment on Richard Callaway's resignation? What does your leadership mean for the future of the airline? Do you feel justice has been served?" Samantha stopped, smoothing the sleeve of her blazer. The attention didn't unnerve her anymore. If anything, she had been preparing for this moment her whole life. She took a measured breath before speaking. "This is more than just my story. It's about creating an industry where no one has to fight just to be treated with dignity. Change is happening, and I'm making sure it lasts." More questions flew her way, but she offered only a poised smile before continuing toward the exit. She didn't need to say more. She had already made her statement through action. As she stepped outside, a sleek black car was waiting for her. Mark leaned against it, arms crossed, sunglasses shielding his eyes. "How does it feel?" he asked as she approached. She smiled. "Like I'm just getting started." Mark chuckled, opening the car door for her. "That's what I was hoping you'd say." As the car pulled away from the airport, Samantha glanced out the window, watching as the building shrank into the distance. The same place that had tried to make her feel small was now just another stop on her journey, a journey where she set the destination. Her phone buzzed with a message. Investor meeting confirmed, 9 a.m. Monday. A new chapter was beginning, one where she wasn't just reacting to injustice, she was leading an empire. Samantha tucked her phone away, exhaling slowly. She had fought for her place in the world. Now, she was making sure no one else had to. Samantha sat in the back of the sleek black car, fingers lightly tapping against the leather armrest. The city lights blurred past her, and for the first time in a long while, she let herself breathe. She had won. Not just a lawsuit, not just a corporate battle, she had rewritten her entire narrative. The same airport that had once denied her a flight was now an airport where she called the shots. The airline that had humiliated her was now hers to command. And yet she wasn't done. Mark sat beside her, checking emails on his tablet. "You're trending again," he muttered, scrolling through articles. "Everyone wants an interview." Samantha smirked. "Let them wait." Mark raised an eyebrow. "That doesn't sound like you. You never turned down a chance to control the narrative." She turned to look at him. "I don't have to control the narrative anymore. I am the narrative." Mark chuckled. "Can't argue with that." The car slowed as they approached one of the city's most exclusive hotels. A grand gala was being held, a gathering of the most powerful figures in the aviation and business industries. Samantha had received an invitation before, but back then, she had been nothing more than an ambitious executive working her way up in a world that refused to see her. Tonight, she was walking in as a CEO. As the chauffeur opened her door, the sound of cameras clicking filled the air. Reporters lined the entrance, shouting her name. Samantha stepped out gracefully, the soft pink silk of her dress catching the light, her presence undeniable. The red carpet was lined with familiar faces, executives, politicians, media moguls. Some had once ignored her, some had once mocked her. Now they were watching her in awe. She walked with purpose, nodding at familiar figures, shaking hands where necessary. But it wasn't until she reached the ballroom that she spotted him. Richard Calloway. He was standing near the bar, engaged in conversation with a group of investors. His once impeccable posture had a slight slouch, his expression carefully neutral, but Samantha could see it, the discomfort. He knew she was here. She didn't approach him immediately. Instead, she let the moment stretch, let him feel her presence before she finally made her way over. The conversation around him quieted as she stopped in front of him, holding out her hand. "Richard," she said smoothly. For a moment he hesitated. Then, reluctantly, he shook her hand. "Samantha." The investors around them exchanged glances, sensing the tension. "I didn't expect to see you here," Calloway admitted, his voice carefully controlled. Samantha tilted her head. "Really? I would have thought you expected me everywhere by now." One of the investors chuckled, clearly amused. Calloway forced a smile. "I see you've wasted no time making changes." Samantha raised an eyebrow. "That's what leadership is about, isn't it?" He nodded slowly. "You may have taken the airline, but the industry is bigger than just one company." She leaned in slightly. "That's the thing, Richard. I didn't just take the airline. I changed the industry. And you? You're just another cautionary tale now." Calloway's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He didn't need to. He had already lost. Samantha turned away, dismissing him as easily as he had once dismissed her. She had bigger things to do. The next morning, Samantha woke to a flood of messages. Mark was already in the hotel suite's lounge, sipping coffee as he scrolled through news updates. "You're officially the most talked about woman in aviation," he said, holding up his tablet. Samantha sat down across from him, glancing at the headlines. Samantha Blake's takeover reshapes the airline industry. The CEO who refused to be denied. From discrimination to domination, the Samantha Blake story. She let out a soft laugh. "Well, they're certainly dramatic." Mark smirked. "They're not wrong." Samantha took a sip of her coffee, letting the warmth settle her thoughts. "We have work to do," she said finally. Mark nodded. "What's next?" She looked out at the skyline, the sun rising over the city. "We expand." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Expand?" She set her coffee down. This was never just about the airline. It was about representation, equality, power. "I don't just want an airline. I want a legacy." Mark grinned. "Now that I can work with?" Samantha stood, straightening her blazer. She had fought to break barriers. Now, she was building empires. And nothing was going to stop her. Samantha stepped into her new office, the sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the luxurious space. The high-rise headquarters of her airline stood tall in the heart of the city, a monument to everything she had built. The weight of responsibility settled over her shoulders, but it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like power. She ran her fingers along the polished surface of the CEO's desk, the same desk that had once belonged to Richard Calloway. The man who had dismissed her, belittled her, tried to erase her. Now, his name was nothing more than a footnote in the company's history. She had written the next chapter. Mark entered the office, dropping a thick folder onto her desk. "You ready for your first full executive meeting?" Samantha smirked. "I was born ready." Mark chuckled. "Good, because they're nervous?" She raised an eyebrow. "Why?" He gestured toward the glass wall overlooking the executive conference room. "They've had the same leadership for years. Now, they're reporting to you. And let's just say, some of them aren't thrilled about it." Samantha's smile didn't waver. "Then let's give them something to really be nervous about." The boardroom was silent when she walked in. The executives, most of them older, mostly men, shifted uncomfortably in their seats as she took her place at the head of the long table. They were used to power looking a certain way, and she wasn't it. She let the silence stretch, watching them, measuring them, before she finally spoke. "This company was built on exclusivity," she said, her voice calm but firm. "For decades, it operated under policies that quietly pushed people like me, and many others, out." She let her gaze move across the table. "That changes today." One of the older board members cleared his throat. "Ms. Blake, I understand your passion, but we have to be careful about making drastic changes. Too much too fast can destabilize operations." Samantha leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, was anyone in this room worried about stability when this airline denied a paying customer a flight simply because of who they are?" Silence. She continued. "Because I don't remember anyone in leadership calling for caution when the company made that decision. In fact, no one in this room spoke up at all, until it cost you money." Several executives looked away, embarrassed. Samantha's tone remained steady. "Let me be clear. We are not just running an airline. We are setting a new standard for the entire industry. And we will not move forward by protecting outdated policies designed to keep people out." A younger executive, a woman, spoke up. "What's your plan?" Samantha's lips curled into a small smile. "First, we're implementing a zero-tolerance discrimination policy. That includes hiring, passenger treatment, and workplace culture. Anyone caught violating it? Gone." One man frowned. "With all due respect, you can't just fire people overnight." Samantha raised an eyebrow. "Watch me." The younger woman grinned. Samantha continued. "Next, we are revising our hiring practices. This airline will actively recruit diverse candidates, from pilots to executives. And yes, that includes trans people, non-binary individuals, people of color, and anyone else who was previously overlooked because they didn't fit some outdated mold." She tapped the folder in front of her. "I've already started reaching out to hiring firms that specialize in inclusive recruitment. The process begins now." Another board member, a man in his 60s, sighed. "You're turning this into a political statement." Samantha met his gaze directly. It was a political statement when this airline chose to exclude people. "I'm just correcting the mistake." He pursed his lips but said nothing. Mark smirked from his seat at the end of the table. "Any other objections?" No one spoke. Samantha nodded. "Good. Then let's get to work." By the next morning, news of the policy overhaul had gone viral. New airline CEO Samantha Blake shakes up industry with bold inclusion policies. Aviation's glass ceiling just got shattered. Meet the woman leading the change. And then, the biggest headline of all. Samantha Blake to launch scholarship program for LGBTQ+ pilots and aviation professionals. Samantha sat in her office, reading the articles as Mark walked in, grinning. "Well, if you weren't the face of the airline industry before, you are now." She set her tablet down. "It's not about me. It's about opening doors that were slammed shut for too long." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Still, you do realize that you just made history?" She exhaled, looking out at the city skyline. She had. But there was still more to do. She turned back to Mark. How soon can we start expanding into international markets? Mark blinked. We just took over, and you're already thinking about global domination? She smirked. Why stop at one airline? Mark chuckled. I'll make some calls. Samantha leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled. She wasn't just fixing a company. She was building an empire. And she was just getting started. Samantha stood at the edge of the private airfield, watching as one of her newly rebranded jets prepared for takeoff. The sleek aircraft gleamed under the golden afternoon sun, its fresh new logo symbolizing more than just a corporate overhaul. It was a statement, a promise of progress. Mark stood beside her, arms crossed, watching the jet climb into the sky. You do realize you've done something that people are going to talk about for decades, right? She smirked. That's the plan. The past few months had been a whirlwind. The policy changes, the firing of outdated executives, the introduction of inclusive hiring initiatives, it had all set the aviation industry ablaze with conversation. Some celebrated her, some resisted her, and others simply watched in awe, waiting to see what would happen next. But Samantha wasn't waiting. She was moving. As they walked back toward the car, Mark glanced at his phone. We've got a meeting in an hour with the new board members. Samantha nodded. The previous board, largely made up of people who had either tolerated or ignored the discrimination within the airline, had been dismantled. In their place, she had brought in people who understood the future, people who wanted to see real change. We're also getting a lot of buy-in from investors who pulled out under Callaway's leadership, Mark added. They see the vision. And more importantly, they see the profits. Samantha chuckled. So, they finally figured out that equality isn't just good ethics, it's good business? Mark smirked. Took them long enough. The two stepped into the car, and as the city skyline came into view, Samantha checked her messages. A flood of congratulations, press requests, and meeting confirmations filled her inbox. But one message stood out. It was from a young trans woman studying aviation. Thank you for what you're doing. Because of you, I believe I actually have a future in this industry. I hope to fly for your airline one day. Samantha stared at the message, something deep in her chest tightening. This was why she did it. Not for revenge. Not just for her own justice. But for every person who had been told, you don't belong here. She turned to Mark. How soon can we get our scholarship program up and running? Mark raised an eyebrow. You're really not going to take a break, are you? She smiled. Not when there's still work to do. The boardroom was buzzing with conversation when Samantha walked in. The newly appointed executives had already taken their seats, their expressions ranging from excitement to quiet admiration. Mark took his seat beside her, setting down his tablet. Everyone's here. Let's begin. Samantha took a moment to scan the room. This was her team now. A team that didn't just accept change, but embraced it. First, she started, I want to acknowledge that we've done something incredible. We didn't just take over a company, we transformed it. A few heads nodded, some smiles appearing around the room. But we're not done. Samantha leaned forward. We've made promises. To our customers, to our employees, to the people who are looking to us as a beacon of change. Now we follow through. She glanced at Mark, who handed out a packet to each board member. This, Samantha continued, is our next phase. One executive flipped through the document, eyes widening. International expansion? Samantha nodded. It's time to go beyond just fixing one airline. It's time to set the standard for the entire industry. Another executive, a woman with years of experience in global markets, smiled. You don't think small, do you? Samantha smirked. Never have, never will. She took a breath, steady and full of conviction. From this point forward, we don't just run an airline. We lead a movement. Weeks later, Samantha stood on a stage at a global aviation summit, addressing some of the most powerful figures in the industry. When I was denied boarding at an airport, it wasn't just a personal inconvenience. It was a reflection of a system that has, for far too long, decided who gets to exist comfortably and who doesn't. She let her words sink in. Air travel is about movement, progress. opportunity. And yet, for so many, it has been the opposite. A place of exclusion, of restriction, of barriers. A wave of applause rippled through the audience. I'm not here to ask for permission to change the industry. I'm here to set the standard for what it should have been all along. Thunderous applause filled the room. And Samantha smiled. Because this was just the beginning.